The summer air in Madrid was thick with heat and anticipation as we stepped out of the airport. Our family vacation to Spain was supposed to be a much-needed escape, a chance to reconnect after a year that had tested our bonds. Luke, had been juggling work stress. My wife Elena seemed to be retreating more into herself, and my son Chris, from a previous marriage, was trying to find his footing as a young adult. This trip was meant to be the remedy, a perfect blend of culture, relaxation, and family bonding. The first few days were idyllic. We strolled through Madrid's cobblestone streets, explored the grandeur of the royal palace, and shared laughs over tapas and sangria at bustling plazas. Elena, with her effortless charm, seemed to be back to her vibrant self, her laughter ringing out like music. Chris, though initially aloof, began to open up, engaging in light-hearted banter that warmed my heart. It wasn't until we reached our villa in Costa Brava that I noticed the subtle shift. The villa was a dream. Its sprawling terrace overlooked the Mediterranean, and the golden sunlight seemed to bathe the world in magic. Yet, I couldn't shake the odd tension that seemed to flicker between Elena and Chris. A fleeting glance here, an awkward silence there. It was subtle, but enough to lodge itself in the back of my mind. That evening, we all sat together on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Elena poured herself another glass of wine, her laughter a little too loud, her gaze lingering on Chris a little too long. Chris, for his part, seemed uneasy, excusing himself to his room earlier than usual. I brushed it off, convincing myself that I was imagining things, that the unease was just a remnant of the work stress I was supposed to leave behind. But as the days unfolded, I began to wonder if I was wrong. There was an undercurrent of something, a tension that I couldn't quite place. And for the first time, I felt the first crack in the perfect image of our family vacation. The next morning, the villa was quiet as the golden Spanish sun flooded the rooms. I was the first to rise, as usual, brewing coffee and stepping out onto the terrace to take in the sea breeze. The peacefulness of the moment helped chase away the strange feelings from the previous night. By the time Elena emerged, her hair still damp from the shower, she was all smiles. She wrapped her arms around me in a gesture that felt warmer than I'd expected, and for a moment, I chastised myself for letting paranoia creep in. "Sleep well?" she asked, her voice light. "Better than I thought I would," I replied, forcing a grin. Chris wandered in later, looking groggy but cheerful. He wolfed down his breakfast, and the three of us decided on a day trip to Girona to explore the ancient city. The drive was filled with casual conversation and playful teasing, and I started to relax again. The tension I thought I'd felt the day before seemed to evaporate under the Spanish sun, but it returned in small, nagging ways throughout the day. Elena and Chris walked a little too close during our strolls through Girona's medieval streets. Her hand brushed his arm in what I hoped was an accidental gesture, and his responses seemed overly polite, almost cautious. As we stopped for lunch at a bustling cafe, I watched them closely. Elena leaned in slightly when she spoke to Chris, her voice just soft enough that I couldn't make out the words. Chris fidgeted, his cheeks slightly flushed, his focus shifting between his plate and the table. "Everything okay?" I asked, breaking their little bubble. Elena looked at me with a bright smile, as though nothing in the world was amiss. "Of course. This place is just so charming, isn't it?" Chris nodded quickly, his agreement feeling slightly forced. That evening, as we sat under the stars on the villa's terrace, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, my insecurities. But a seed of doubt had taken root, and no amount of rationalizing could keep it from growing. There was something there, something I couldn't yet define but could no longer deny. And for the first time, I felt the weight of unease settle over me like a shadow. The following day, we decided to stay at the villa to enjoy a slower pace. The Mediterranean breeze carried the scent of salt and sun as we lounged by the pool, each of us engrossed in our own worlds. Elena flipped through a novel, Chris scrolled on his phone, and I nursed a beer, trying to convince myself to let go of the unease that had begun to haunt me. But it became impossible to ignore when I noticed how often Elena's gaze flicked toward Chris. It wasn't obvious. She had a way of making it seem casual, like she was checking on him the way any caring stepmother would. Yet, there was something in the softness of her expression, the lingering quality of her eyes, that sent a chill through me. Chris seemed to notice, too. He avoided eye contact with her, his body language stiff, as though he were trying to keep a careful distance. When Elena got up to grab another drink, I took the opportunity to speak. "You okay, kiddo?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Chris nodded quickly. "Yeah, why wouldn't I be?" I hesitated, unsure of how to voice my concerns without sounding paranoid. "You've been quiet. Just making sure you're enjoying yourself." He shrugged. "Yeah, it's been good. Spain's different." Before I could press further, Elena returned, her cheerful demeanor erasing any chance of continuing the conversation. She suggested we all take a walk down to the beach, and Chris agreed almost too quickly, as if he was eager to escape the moment. At the beach, the tension only grew. Elena insisted on taking a selfie with Chris, wrapping an arm around his shoulders in a way that made him visibly uncomfortable. I snapped the picture for them, forcing a smile that felt unnatural on my face. When Chris excused himself to take a walk along the shoreline, Elena watched him go with an expression that made my stomach tighten. "You seem close with him lately," I ventured, trying to sound casual. Her eyes flicked to me, her expression unreadable. "He's had a tough year. I'm just trying to make sure he's okay." The words were innocuous, but her tone was off, too defensive, too measured. It wasn't like Elena to be guarded with me, and it sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Elena slept beside me. My mind churned with questions I didn't want to ask, scenarios I didn't want to imagine. Something was wrong, but I didn't know how to confront it without tearing apart the fragile peace we had come here to find. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't ready to face. By the fourth day, the villa's tranquil setting felt oppressive. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it all began to unravel, but the unease had become a constant companion. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That evening, after a quiet dinner, I decided to take a walk along the beach to clear my head. Elena said she was tired and headed to bed early, while Chris lingered in the living room, half-heartedly watching a Spanish game show on TV. I offered to leave the villa door unlocked for him when I left, but he waved me off, saying he wouldn't stay up much longer. The beach was serene, its stillness a stark contrast to the turmoil in my mind. The waves lapped gently at the shore, and the stars reflected off the water like scattered diamonds. I walked aimlessly, letting the cool night air wash over me, but no amount of calm could quiet the storm of doubt building within. When I returned to the villa, it was close to midnight. The lights were off, save for the faint glow coming from Chris's room at the end of the hall. I stepped into the kitchen for a glass of water, trying to collect myself, when I heard the faint murmur of voices. My heart skipped. The sound was coming from Elena's room. At first, I thought she was on the phone, but as I moved closer, I realized there was another voice, a lower, hesitant tone that unmistakably belonged to Chris. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see shadows moving inside. My pulse quickened as I strained to hear what was being said. "This isn't a good idea." Chris's voice was soft but firm, laced with tension. "It doesn't have to mean anything," Elena whispered back, her voice carrying an unsettling mix of urgency and reassurance. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced to rationalize what I was hearing, but no explanation made sense. As much as I wanted to push the door open and demand answers, I couldn't bring myself to move. The fear of what I might discover held me rooted in place. A moment later, the sound of movement inside the room jolted me into action. I stepped back into the shadows, retreating to the kitchen as quietly as I could. My heart pounded as I grabbed my water and went to my room, locking the door behind me. Lying in bed, I felt a mix of rage, confusion, and betrayal swirl in my chest. I told myself I couldn't jump to conclusions, but the pieces were starting to fall into place in a way that made me feel sick. I had to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The morning after the unsettling midnight encounter, I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own life. Elena was already in the kitchen, humming as she made breakfast. Chris sat at the table, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. Everything appeared normal, but to me, it felt like a performance. "Morning, sleepyhead," Elena said with a bright smile, placing a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me. "Morning," I mumbled, avoiding her gaze. My mind was still spinning from the fragments of their conversation I'd overheard the night before. Chris seemed subdued, his usual chatter replaced by an almost deliberate silence. He avoided looking at Elena, his focus locked on his phone. I studied his face, searching for any signs of what might have happened. His jaw was tight, and his fingers tapped anxiously against the table, a stark contrast to his usual laid-back demeanor. "What's on the agenda for today?" Elena asked, her tone breezy as she sipped her orange juice. I shrugged. "Maybe head into town. Walk around a bit." "Sounds good," she said, her smile unwavering. She turned to Chris. "What about you?" Chris hesitated, his eyes darting to me before answering. "I might just hang out here. I could use a quiet day." Elena's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Whatever you need, sweetie." Sweetie. The word landed wrong, like an off-key note in a symphony. It wasn't uncommon for her to use terms of endearment, but now, in the wake of my growing suspicions, it felt overly intimate, even calculated. Throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking through a minefield. Elena seemed oblivious, chatting and laughing as if nothing was amiss, but Chris grew more withdrawn with each passing hour. He excused himself after lunch and disappeared into his room, leaving Elena and me alone on the terrace. "Chris has been quiet lately," I said, testing the waters. Elena tilted her head, feigning concern. "He's probably just tired. Or maybe he's feeling a little out of place here. You know how it is with kids his age. They'd rather be with their friends." Her explanation sounded plausible, but the undercurrent of something unspoken lingered. I nodded, deciding not to press further. For now. That evening, as I stood on the terrace watching the sunset, I noticed Chris sitting alone by the pool. He stared into the water, his expression distant, as though he were carrying a weight he couldn't share. It took everything in me not to walk over and demand the truth. But something told me the answers would come soon enough, whether I was ready for them or not. The next morning, I woke to an unsettling silence. The usual sounds of Elena moving around the villa or Chris's music playing softly from his room were absent. The stillness set my nerves on edge as I got up and made my way to the kitchen. Elena was seated at the counter, her face partially hidden behind a cup of coffee. She looked tired, her usually flawless demeanor slightly disheveled. Chris was nowhere to be seen. "Morning," I said, forcing a casual tone. She glanced up and smiled weakly. "Morning." Chris went for a walk along the beach. "I think he needed some space." I nodded, pouring myself a cup of coffee and leaning against the counter. The tension between us was palpable, an unspoken acknowledgement of the growing cracks in the foundation of our family dynamic. "You okay?" I asked after a moment. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "Yeah, just tired. I didn't sleep well." I could have left it at that, but my frustration simmered beneath the surface. "You and Chris seem off lately. Did something happen?" Her eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. "No, not at all. Why would you ask that?" "It just feels like there's something you're not telling me," I said, keeping my tone even. Elena's expression hardened slightly, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "You're imagining things, Luke. Everything's fine." Her dismissal only fueled my suspicions, but I decided not to push further. If there was something to uncover, it wouldn't happen through direct confrontation. Not yet, anyway. Later that afternoon, Chris returned from his walk. He looked more composed, but his usual easygoing demeanor was still absent. I suggested we all head into town together, hoping to break the tension. To my relief, they both agreed. The trip into town felt like an awkward dance. Elena and Chris avoided being too close to each other, while I kept a careful eye on their interactions. At one point, as we wandered through a bustling market, Elena reached out to adjust Chris's shirt collar. The gesture was brief, but it felt charged, like an unspoken secret had passed between them. That night, as we sat down to dinner on the terrace, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Conversations were stilted, and laughter felt forced. I found myself watching them both, analyzing every word and gesture, searching for cracks in the carefully maintained facade. By the time we finished eating, I felt exhausted, not from the day's activities, but from the emotional weight of my growing doubts. As I lay in bed later that night, listening to the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore, I resolved to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Something was happening between Elena and Chris, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The following day, I woke up to an empty villa. The faint sound of waves outside was the only thing that greeted me as I wandered into the kitchen. A note on the counter, written in Elena's flowing script, read, "Chris and I went into town to pick up a few things. Be back soon. Love you." The words should have been reassuring, but instead, they sent a shiver of unease through me. Why hadn't they waited for me? It was unlike Elena to head out without at least asking if I wanted to join. I spent the next hour pacing the villa, trying to ignore the nagging voice in my head that whispered worst-case scenarios. When another hour passed with no sign of them, I grabbed my phone and called Elena. It went straight to voicemail. I tried Chris next. Same result. The unease settled into something heavier, and for a moment, I considered driving into town to look for them. But the rational part of me held back. I didn't want to come across as paranoid, not yet. Instead, I sat on the terrace, my eyes fixed on the winding road that led down to the villa, waiting for their return. When they finally pulled up just before lunch, Elena's face was flushed, and Chris looked unusually tense. They stepped out of the car carrying a couple of bags filled with groceries and trinkets, but it didn't escape my notice how they avoided each other's gaze. "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Elena smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "We got caught up in town. The market was crowded, and then we grabbed some coffee." Chris walked past me without a word, heading straight to his room. His door clicked shut with a finality that left no room for conversation. Elena set the bags on the counter and began unpacking them. "What's with the interrogation?" she asked lightly, though her voice carried a defensive edge. "I wasn't interrogating," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I just didn't expect you to be gone so long." She sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I didn't realize we were on a strict schedule. Can't we just enjoy the vacation, Luke?" Her deflection only added to my unease. I wanted to press further, to ask what had really kept them, but I knew it would only escalate into an argument. Instead, I turned and headed out to the terrace, my chest tight with a mix of anger and suspicion. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, the air between us felt charged. Chris barely spoke, picking at his food while Elena tried to keep the conversation light. I watched them both, feeling like an outsider in my own family. The weight of unspoken truths hung heavy over the table, and for the first time, I found myself wondering if this vacation was a mistake. Later that night, as the villa settled into silence, I stayed up on the terrace, nursing a glass of wine and staring out at the dark expanse of the sea. I couldn't shake the feeling that the missing hours in town were more than just a delay at the market. And whatever secrets were being kept, I was determined to uncover them. The next morning, the atmosphere in the villa was stifling. It felt as though every interaction was coated with a layer of unease that no one could quite address. Chris remained withdrawn, barely speaking beyond the necessary, while Elena oscillated between forced cheerfulness and quiet introspection. I decided to break the routine by suggesting a drive up the coast to explore a neighboring seaside town. Elena hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly to Chris before she agreed. Chris, however, shook his head. "I think I'll just stay here today," he muttered. "Come on," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "It'll do you good to get out." "I'm good, really," he insisted, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Elena opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, her expression unreadable. The drive with Elena was quiet, save for the occasional comment about the scenery or plans for the next day. She seemed preoccupied, her usual vibrant energy dulled. I couldn't decide if she was genuinely distracted or carefully avoiding something. When we returned to the villa late that afternoon, Chris was lounging by the pool, earbuds in and sunglasses masking his expression. The scene looked perfectly ordinary, but something about the way he tensed as we approached told me he wasn't as relaxed as he appeared. Elena walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, we're back. Did you eat anything?" Chris shrugged without removing his earbuds, his face turned away. Elena lingered for a moment before retreating into the villa, leaving me standing there, watching the strange dynamic unfold. That evening, the tension reached a breaking point. We were halfway through dinner when Elena excused herself to grab another glass of wine. As soon as she was out of earshot, Chris looked up at me, his expression conflicted. "Dad," he began, his voice hesitant. I put down my fork, leaning in slightly. "What's on your mind?" Chris opened his mouth to speak but faltered, his gaze shifting toward the kitchen where Elena was rummaging through cabinets. He shook his head. "Never mind." "Chris," I said firmly, my voice low, "if something's wrong, you can tell me." He hesitated, his hands fidgeting with his napkin, before standing abruptly. "I'm going to bed." He left the table without another word, disappearing down the hall. A moment later, Elena returned, her wineglass in hand. She glanced at the empty seat, frowning. "Where did Chris go?" she asked. "Bed," I said shortly, my frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Elena's frown deepened, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she sat down and took a long sip of wine, her eyes fixed on the flickering candle in the center of the table. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the things we weren't saying. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I replayed the evening's events in my mind. Chris had wanted to tell me something. I was sure of it. But something, or someone, had stopped him. And as the villa settled into an uneasy quiet once again, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that whatever he'd been about to say was the truth I was afraid to hear. The following morning, the villa seemed unusually quiet. Elena was still in bed when I got up, and Chris was nowhere to be found. I brewed coffee, stepping out onto the terrace to sip it while the morning sun bathed the coastline in soft gold. The calm felt like a cruel contrast to the storm brewing inside me. By mid-morning, Chris still hadn't returned. I asked Elena if she'd seen him. "He mentioned something about going for a hike," she said casually, though her tone felt too rehearsed. "You know how he likes to clear his head." I nodded, but her explanation didn't sit right. Chris wasn't the type to venture off without saying anything. As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the growing unease in my chest. Something was wrong. Elena tried to keep herself busy, rearranging the flowers in the villa or scrolling through her phone. But I noticed her glancing toward the door every few minutes, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. When Chris finally returned that afternoon, he looked exhausted, his clothes damp with sweat and his face pale. He brushed past us with a mumbled greeting, heading straight for the shower. Elena watched him go, her expression unreadable, and I decided I couldn't let this go on any longer. After dinner, I pulled Chris aside as Elena cleaned up in the kitchen. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm but calm. Chris froze, his eyes darting toward Elena before meeting mine. "About what?" "You've been acting strange this whole trip, and so has Elena. If something's going on, I need to know." Chris hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the kitchen again. "It's nothing, Dad." "Don't lie to me, Chris," I said, my patience thinning. "Whatever it is, I can handle it. But I need the truth." His face crumpled for a moment, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something he clearly didn't want to carry. Then he looked me square in the eye and said, "I can't." Before I could press him further, Elena walked in, wiping her hands on a towel. She glanced between us, her smile too bright. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Chris said quickly, stepping away from me. "I'm going to bed." He left the room without another word, leaving me standing there with Elena, who was now eyeing me warily. "What were you two talking about?" "Just trying to figure out what's been bothering him," I said, my tone sharp enough to make her flinch. "I told you, he's had a rough year," she said, turning away to tidy the already clean counter. "Give him some space." But I couldn't let it go. The unease that had been building all week had reached its breaking point. That night, after Elena went to bed, I stayed up, pacing the living room as I tried to piece everything together. The glances, the tension, the missing hours in town. All of it painted a picture I didn't want to see. I decided to check the villa's security system, hoping to find answers in the camera footage. As I scrolled through clips from the past few days, my heart began to pound. The footage from the day Elena and Chris went into town was missing. The system had been turned off. I leaned back, my stomach twisting with dread. Someone had deliberately erased those hours, and I was beginning to think I already knew why. The following morning, I awoke with a sense of determination. My suspicions had reached their peak, and I was done ignoring the signs. Elena and Chris were seated at the breakfast table when I joined them, their conversation stilted and polite. They looked up as I entered, their faces masking something I could no longer pretend wasn't there. "I need to talk to both of you," I said, my voice firm. Elena exchanged a quick glance with Chris, her smile faltering. "What's wrong?" "Not here," I replied. "On the terrace." They followed me out, the tension palpable. The morning sun was blinding as we stood facing each other, the sound of waves crashing against the shore filling the silence. "I want the truth," I said, looking at them both. "Something's been off this whole trip, and I'm done pretending it's nothing." Chris looked panicked, his face paling as he glanced at Elena. She, on the other hand, drew herself up, her expression shifting into one of forced calm. "Luke," she began, her voice soft, "you're being ridiculous." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't gaslight me, Elena. I've seen the way you two interact, the missing footage from the security system, the secrecy. I'm not imagining this." Chris stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Dad, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Tell me, Chris. Tell me why you can't look me in the eye, why you're so tense around her. What's been going on?" His eyes filled with tears as he looked away, his hands clenching into fists. Elena reached for him, but I stepped between them, my chest heaving with rage. "Don't touch him," I barked at her. Elena's composure cracked. "Fine," she snapped. "You want the truth, Luke? I'll give you the truth." She took a step back, folding her arms. "Yes, something happened between Chris and me, but it wasn't what you think." My stomach dropped as her words hung in the air. Chris groaned, running his hands through his hair. "Stop it, Elena. Just stop." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fury and dread. Chris finally spoke, his voice raw. "She came on to me, Dad. I didn't want this to happen. She said it didn't mean anything, but..." He choked on the words, his anguish clear. Time seemed to freeze as his confession sank in. Elena's expression turned defiant, though a flicker of guilt danced in her eyes. "It was a mistake," she said quickly. "We were both confused and..." "Confused?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "You're my wife. He's my son. How could you..." I couldn't finish the sentence. The betrayal burned in my chest like wildfire, threatening to consume me. Chris stepped back, his face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know how to tell you." I turned on Elena, my hands shaking. "You disgust me," I said, my voice low and venomous. "Both of you." Without another word, I stormed back into the villa, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I was in our bedroom, throwing open the closet to start packing. My hands moved mechanically as my mind raced, trying to process the depth of the betrayal. By the time I finished, I had one goal in mind: revenge. Elena and Chris thought they could shatter my world and walk away unscathed. They were wrong. The rest of the day was a blur of suppressed rage and quiet resolve. Elena and Chris avoided me, retreating to their respective corners of the villa like two guilty children awaiting punishment. I didn't care. My focus was singular now: retribution. I spent the evening methodically planning my next steps. I couldn't let them walk away from this unscathed. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a calculated destruction of the trust and love I'd poured into them both. They'd made their choices, and I intended to make them face the consequences. I started small. While Elena was showering, I slipped her phone from the counter and scrolled through her messages. Most had been deleted, but a few fragments remained. Cryptic messages to Chris, seemingly innocent but now painfully clear in their intent. I forwarded them to my email for safekeeping. Next, I accessed the villa's security system from my laptop. Although some footage had been erased, I managed to recover fragments of deleted files. The grainy images showed Elena and Chris sitting too close on the couch, their body language intimate in a way that turned my stomach. The recovered footage and messages weren't much on their own, but together, they painted a picture I could use. I wasn't just gathering evidence for myself. I wanted it documented, undeniable. If they thought I'd let this go quietly, they were sorely mistaken. As the villa grew quiet, I began phase 2. I slipped into Chris's room under the guise of checking on him, finding him asleep. His phone sat on the bedside table, unguarded. Guilt gnawed at me as I picked it up, but it was quickly smothered by the memory of his earlier confession. I scrolled through his messages and found a hidden thread with Elena under a generic contact name. It was all there. Exchanges that confirmed the emotional affair and suggested a physical one. I forwarded those messages to my email, too, carefully erasing any sign I'd accessed his phone. By the time I returned to my room, the plan was clear in my mind. I wouldn't confront them again. Not yet. I wanted them to think they'd dodged a bullet, that my anger was fleeting. Only then would I strike. I sent an email to a lawyer back home, attaching the recovered messages and footage. I outlined my situation and requested advice on divorce proceedings and potential legal actions against Elena. I didn't know if I could formally sever ties with Chris, but I planned to explore every avenue. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in days, I felt in control. They thought they had shattered me, but they had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I woke early, my mind sharp with resolve. Chris and Elena were still avoiding me, their guilt palpable in every careful movement. It suited my plan perfectly. Their discomfort gave me the space I needed to prepare my next move. I decided to test the waters. Over breakfast, I kept my tone light, my words measured. "We leave for home in a couple of days," I said, glancing at Elena. "Maybe we should do something special before we go. One last day trip." She looked up from her coffee, her expression wary. "That sounds nice." Chris nodded wordlessly, his face a mask of exhaustion. I knew he wasn't sleeping. His guilt must have kept him tossing and turning. Good. He deserved it. We agreed to visit a historic vineyard nearby, a short drive from the villa. The outing was quiet, the tension beneath the surface palpable. Elena tried to act as though everything was normal, making casual comments about the scenery and the wine. Chris remained silent, and I played along, pretending to enjoy the day. But I wasn't there to enjoy anything. I was waiting, watching, letting them think I'd moved past the explosion on the terrace. I wanted them comfortable enough to believe they'd weathered the storm, at least for now. That night, as the villa settled into silence, I made my move. I found Elena in the living room, sipping a glass of wine and scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up as I entered, though her posture stiffened slightly. "Can we talk?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She hesitated, then nodded, gesturing for me to sit. Of course. I didn't sit. Instead, I stood over her, my hands clasped behind my back. "I want to make something very clear," I began, my voice low and steady. "I know everything, and I have proof." Elena's face paled, her wineglass trembling slightly in her hand. "Luke, save it," I snapped. "You've already said enough. The messages, the security footage, it's all there. You can't talk your way out of this." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her composure crumbling under the weight of my words. "It was a mistake," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It didn't mean anything." "Don't insult me," I said, my voice cold. "You crossed the line, Elena. Both of you did, and you're going to pay for it." Before she could respond, I turned and left the room, leaving her frozen in place. My heart was pounding, but I felt a grim satisfaction as I climbed the stairs to Chris's room. It was time for the second half of the confrontation. Chris looked up in alarm when I pushed the door open. He was sitting on the bed, his phone in his hand. His eyes widened as he saw my expression. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. "Dad, You don't get to speak. I cut him off. You don't get to explain. You made your choice. Now you get to live with the consequences. He looked down, his face twisted with shame. I'm sorry, he whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. Sorry doesn't cut it, I said. You've destroyed our family, Chris. Do you even understand that? His shoulders shook, and I realized he was crying. For a moment, my heart softened, but I quickly steeled myself. He needed to feel this pain. He needed to know what he'd done. This doesn't end here, I said, my voice hard. I've already contacted a lawyer. I'm starting divorce proceedings with Elena. As for you, I hesitated, the weight of my words crushing. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. Chris's sobs filled the room as I turned and walked away. I left him to grapple with the fallout of his actions, feeling both victorious and hollow. As I returned to my room, I knew the endgame was in sight. But revenge wasn't as sweet as I thought it would be. Instead, it tasted bitter, laced with heartbreak and the remnants of a family that would never be whole again. The day after the confrontations was unnervingly quiet. Neither Elena nor Chris attempted to speak to me, and the villa felt like a powder keg, one spark away from erupting. I used the silence to my advantage, methodically tying up loose ends for my plan. The lawyer I'd contacted had responded promptly, outlining the next steps for the divorce. Elena's betrayal, combined with the evidence I'd gathered, would make the process swift and financially favorable for me. It was a small consolation, but it gave me a sense of control in the chaos. Chris, on the other hand, was another matter. I hadn't yet decided how to deal with the relationship, if it could even be called that anymore. He was my son, my flesh and blood, but his actions had severed something between us that felt irreparable. Still, a part of me hoped he'd find a way to atone, to at least acknowledge the depth of his betrayal. The day passed in strained silence, the three of us moving around the villa like strangers. I caught glimpses of Elena pacing on the terrace, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Chris stayed in his room, his door shut like a barrier against the world. That evening, I decided to bait them one last time. I suggested a final dinner in town, an attempt to salvage some semblance of normalcy before we returned home. They both hesitated but eventually agreed, their expressions wary. The restaurant was beautiful, a small coastal spot overlooking the sea. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the water, and the scent of fresh seafood filled the air. It should have been perfect, but the tension at our table was palpable. I made casual conversation, pretending to enjoy the meal while I observed them both. Elena barely touched her food, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Chris avoided looking at either of us, his movements mechanical as he ate. When dessert arrived, I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. I've been thinking about this trip, I began, my tone neutral. Elena looked up, her expression cautious. And it's been enlightening. I let the words hang in the air, watching as their unease deepened. I hope you both understand the damage you've done, I continued, my voice low but steady. This isn't something I can't forgive. Not now, maybe not ever. Chris looked down, his face flushing with shame. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass, but she said nothing. This will be the last time we sit at a table like this, I said. When we get back, everything changes. Neither of them responded. The weight of my words seemed to crush whatever defenses they had left. As we returned to the villa that night, the silence between us was absolute. I could feel the end drawing near, the inevitable collapse of the fragile truce we'd maintained. I didn't sleep that night, my mind racing with the final steps of my plan. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I was ready. Tomorrow, everything would come to a head, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning of our departure dawned crisp and clear, the villa bathed in the golden light of a Spanish sunrise. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to take it all in, the shimmering sea, the warm breeze carrying the scent of salt and citrus. It was a cruel irony that such beauty framed the end of everything I'd once held dear. Elena was the first to wake. She moved about the villa quietly, gathering the last of her belongings. When our eyes met over the kitchen counter, she opened her mouth as if to speak, but I cut her off with a curt shake of my head. Whatever she wanted to say, I didn't want to hear it. Chris emerged shortly after, his face pale and his movements hesitant. He avoided looking at either of us, his guilt written in every line of his posture. It didn't matter. By the end of the day, there would be no more pretending, no more tiptoeing around the truth. As we loaded the car, I felt an odd sense of detachment. This was no longer my family. It was a broken collection of individuals tied together by betrayal. The drive to the airport was excruciatingly silent, each mile bringing us closer to the inevitable confrontation I had planned. At the terminal, I handed Elena her ticket and turned to Chris, pressing his into his hand. "You're flying back with her," I said flatly. His head snapped up, confusion flashing in his eyes. "What? You're not coming?" "No," I replied, my voice cold. "I'm staying a little longer. There are some things I need to take care of." Elena stepped forward, her face a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Luke, what's going on?" I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "You'll find out soon enough." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. My steps were deliberate as I headed toward the airport's cafe, where I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching planes taxi on the runway. Hours later, when I was sure they'd boarded their flight, I opened my laptop and sent the prepared emails to Elena and Chris. Attached were the screenshots of their messages, the recovered security footage, and a scathing letter detailing every way they had betrayed me. To Elena, I made it clear that divorce proceedings had already begun. I informed her that I would be seeking full control of our joint assets, backed by the damning evidence of her affair. To Chris, I expressed my devastation, my anger, and my decision to cut him off financially until he could prove he deserved a place in my life again. I sat back, staring at the screen as the emails sent successfully. My chest felt hollow, but I also felt a strange sense of freedom. The betrayal had been like a weight around my neck, and now I was finally cutting myself loose. I booked a new flight for myself that evening, knowing I couldn't remain in Spain much longer. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I took one last look at the beauty around me. Then I turned away, ready to face the fallout of the storm I'd unleashed. The flight back home felt both endless and strangely cathartic. As I stared out at the clouds, my thoughts were a storm of emotions. Grief for what I had lost, anger at the betrayal, and a grim satisfaction at having taken control of the situation. Whatever awaited me on the other side of this, I was ready to face it. When I landed, the emails had already done their work. Elena had tried to call me multiple times during the flight, her messages ranging from desperate pleas to thinly veiled threats. I deleted them all without reading past the preview text. Chris had sent only one message: "I'm sorry, Dad. Please don't give up on me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not yet. Over the next week, the fallout unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. Elena's lawyer reached out, her tone conciliatory, knowing the evidence I held gave me the upper hand. I kept the negotiations swift and decisive, stripping away any financial advantage she might have hoped to gain. Chris, on the other hand, was a different story. He sent more messages, apologies, explanations, and pleas for forgiveness. Each one chipped away at the wall I had built around my heart, but I wasn't ready to confront him yet. His betrayal wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a deep, personal wound that would take time to heal, if it ever could. I focused on rebuilding my life. I moved out of the house I had shared with Elena, unable to bear the memories that haunted its walls. I rented a small apartment on the other side of town, the simplicity of the space offering a sense of renewal. Therapy became a regular part of my routine. Talking through the pain helped me process it, and slowly, I began to feel the weight lifting. My therapist urged me to consider reconnecting with Chris, not for his sake, but for mine. "He's young," she said. "He made a terrible mistake, but if you can find a way to rebuild that relationship, it might bring you peace in the long run." Months later, I agreed to meet him for coffee. When I saw him sitting at the corner table, looking older and more fragile than I remembered, I felt a pang of both love and sorrow. He stood as I approached, his face etched with guilt. "Dad," he said quietly. I nodded, sitting across from him. "Chris." The conversation was long and difficult. He didn't try to justify his actions, and for that, I was grateful. He admitted his mistakes, expressed his regret, and told me how much he missed the bond we once had. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said finally, my voice trembling, "but I'm willing to try. If you want to rebuild this, you'll have to prove to me that you deserve it." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will, Dad. I promise." As I left the cafe that day, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative thing, but hope nonetheless. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. Elena was gone from my life, a chapter closed. Chris and I had a long way to go, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Spain had been the site of my family's destruction, but it had also been the beginning of something new, a journey toward healing, growth, and rediscovery. The scars would remain, but they would no longer define me.